The bullet hit the wall 6 inches from Brooke's head. Plaster exploded across her face. She didn't scream. She dropped. Pure instinct, pulled the wounded man beneath her and pressed both hands into the hole in his chest while the world came apart around her. Armed men were already inside the wire. 3 of them moved through the medical bay like they owned it, rifles up, kicking over equipment, shouting in a language she knew. One grabbed her by the collar and yanked her upright, pressing the barrel hard against her temple. He expected her to beg. What he got instead stopped him cold. Because the woman looking back at him wasn't afraid. She was calculating. Before we go any further, if this story already has you feeling something, please take a second and hit that subscribe button, and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story can travel. Now let's get into it. The base didn't have a name on any official map. It existed the way a lot of things in East Africa existed, quietly, necessarily, and without ceremony. A cluster of hardened structures surrounded by wire and heat, and the kind of silence that never quite felt peaceful. The forward operating base sat on the edge of a region where the news rarely reached, where the people who lived nearby had long since stopped being surprised by the sound of helicopters or the distant crack of rifle fire. For them, it was just the world. For the Americans stationed there, it was a different kind of reality. The kind that followed you home. Brooke Aldridge arrived on a Tuesday. Nobody remembered which Tuesday. The days blurred together at that base the way they always did in places like that, where the heat started before sunrise and the work never really ended. She came in on a transport with 3 crates of medical supplies, a worn green duffel, and a laminated badge that identified her as a contracted civilian trauma nurse attached to Naval Special Warfare Support Operations. She was 38 years old, medium height, lean in the way people get lean when they've been working hard their whole lives, rather than spending time in a gym. Dark hair pulled back, no jewelry, no makeup. Eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green that made people feel, without quite knowing why, like she had already seen them and made her assessment and moved on. She introduced herself once, briefly, to the base administrator, signed the papers she was given, asked 2 logistical questions about the medical bay, and then went to work. She did not make conversation. She did not join the communal meals more than necessary. She did not ask about the missions or the men or the long stretches of night when the base went tense and quiet and everyone walked a little differently. She just showed up every morning, ran her bay the way she ran everything, tight, clean, methodical. And at the end of the day, she went back to her bunk and read or slept and did it all again. The SEALs noticed her the way they noticed everything, carefully, from a distance, with the particular professional wariness of men who had learned never to take anything at face value. Petty Officer Second Class Dylan Mercer noticed her first, mostly because he'd caught a ricochet fragment in his forearm during a training exercise 2 days after she arrived, and had ended up in the medical bay while she stitched him up. He was 24, 2 years into his career, still holding on to some of the enthusiasm that the job hadn't yet fully stripped away. He watched her hands while she worked. Steady, precise. She used exactly the right amount of pressure and the right technique, and she didn't make unnecessary small talk while she did it, which he appreciated. "You've done this before," he said, not a question. She glanced up briefly. "I have." "Where?" She tied off the last suture and reached for the bandage. "Enough places." He watched her face. There was nothing evasive in it. It wasn't the deflection of someone hiding something embarrassing. It was something quieter than that. The answer of a person who simply didn't feel the need to explain themselves. "You were in?" he asked. She pressed the bandage down and smoothed the edges without looking up. "Keep that dry for 48 hours. Come back if it starts to show heat or discharge." Dylan opened his mouth, closed it, and then did something that surprised even himself. He said, "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him then, just for a moment. Something in her expression shifted, so briefly he almost missed it. and then it was gone, replaced by the calm, professional flatness she wore like armor. "Good," she said. He told the others about her. Not in any dramatic way, just the way men in close quarters share information about the people around them. He said she was quiet and competent, and that something about her was off, and not in a bad way, just in the way that some people were off when they had more experience than they were letting on. The others filed it away the way they filed most things. Noted, unconfirmed, not worth acting on yet. Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Voss acted on it immediately. Voss had been a SEAL for 16 years. He was 41, broad, and carried himself with a particular economy of movement that came from having been in enough real situations to eliminate all the unnecessary ones. He commanded the platoon the way he commanded everything, directly, with expectations that were high and non-negotiable, and with a patience for civilians that could generously be described as limited. He did not like contractors. He didn't like the paperwork they generated, didn't like the liability they represented, and didn't like the way some of them came into environments like this one and started operating as though their civilian credentials gave them authority they hadn't earned. He'd seen it before. Medical personnel were the worst in his experience. They came in with their badges and their protocols and their sense of importance, and they got in the way during the moments when getting in the way could get somebody killed. He read Brooke Aldridge's file on her second day. Civilian contractor, trauma nursing background, previous deployment support in 2 other regions, references that checked out through legitimate channels, no red flags. He told himself that was sufficient. It wasn't. On day 4, he walked into the medical bay unannounced while she was running a supply inventory with 2 of his junior guys, both of whom she had apparently recruited to help her reorganize the storage system. She was pointing at a shelf and talking, calm and direct, and both men were listening. "What is this?" Voss said. She turned to look at him. She didn't straighten up, didn't adjust her posture, didn't do any of the things people usually did when Voss walked into a room with that voice and that expression. She just looked at him with those gray-green eyes and waited. "I'm reorganizing the trauma supply storage," she said. "Your current layout has critical hemorrhage control items on the bottom shelf behind wound irrigation supplies. If we have a mass casualty event, that configuration will cost time, potentially a life." Voss looked at his 2 men. They both found something very interesting to look at on the floor. "These men have duties," he said. "They do," she agreed. "They also have 15 minutes before the briefing, and this will take 12. He walked to within 4 feet of her. He was 6'2" and outweighed her by at least 70 pounds, and he had, on more than one occasion, used proximity and silence to make people reconsider their choices. She looked up at him without any visible adjustment in her physiology. No tension in her jaw, no change in her breathing. Her hands were resting at her sides, relaxed. "You don't give assignments to my men," he said. "I asked for help reorganizing a shelf," she said. "They volunteered. Then they volunteered without my authorization. With respect, Senior Chief, authorization for a 12-minute shelf reorganization isn't typically a command decision." There was a beat of absolute silence in the room. Voss turned his head slowly and looked at the 2 junior men. They were both very, very still. "Get out," he said quietly. They left. Fast. He turned back to her. She hadn't moved. "Let me be clear about something," he said. "I don't know what kind of operation you ran before you came here, but on this base, in my area of operations, civilians do not give direction to my people without going through me. That is not a debate. That is not subject to your professional opinion about shelf organization. That is how this works." She held his gaze. "Understood. You're here to provide medical support when requested," he continued. "You are not a team member. You are not integrated into this unit. You are a contracted support asset, and you will operate within those boundaries." "Understood," she said again. Same tone, same steadiness. He waited for more, for pushback, for defensiveness, for the kind of justified irritation that any reasonable person might have shown in response to the way he was speaking to her. There was nothing, not resignation, not wounded dignity, just a clear, settled stillness that he didn't know what to do with. "We clear?" he said. "We're clear," she said. He held her gaze for another 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked out. He told himself he'd handled it properly. He had. He knew he had. But something kept pulling at the back of his mind in a way he couldn't quite identify. The way you feel when you've solved a puzzle, but one piece doesn't quite sit flush with the others. Dylan found Brooke in the medical bay late that evening. He'd come back on a pretense, wanting to have the sutures checked, even though they were fine, and he knew it. And she knew it too, but she checked them anyway without comment. "Senior Chief come down on you pretty hard today," he said. She disposed of the gloves without looking up. It was a professional conversation. "That's generous." She glanced at him. "Dylan." "Yeah. Has he been wrong yet?" "In the field. About a decision that mattered." Dylan thought about it. He thought about 3 separate situations in the past year when he'd questioned something Voss had called, and in each case, within hours, Voss had been proven right. He thought about the 2 guys from a different team who'd gone home in bags because their senior chief had made different calls. "No," he said, "not yet." "Then don't be too quick to take my side," she said. "He's protecting what he's responsible for. That's his job. It's a good quality in someone who holds lives in their hands." Dylan stared at her. "You're defending the guy who just told you to stay in your lane." "I'm observing something true," she said. "There's a difference." He shook his head slowly. "Lady, I have no idea what to make of you." She almost smiled. It was the closest thing to warmth he'd seen from her. "Keep the sutures dry another 24 hours, she said. "You're fine." He was halfway out the door when she said, without looking up from what she was writing, "Dylan." He turned. "The way you carry your weapon," she said. "Left-hand dominant, but you're shooting right-handed because that's how you trained. You're losing half a second on your transitions that you don't need to lose." He blinked. "How did you—" "Good night," she said. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then walked out into the dark. The next week was quiet in the way forward operating bases in contested regions are never actually quiet. 2 missions went out. Both came back with all personnel. Brooke treated a sprained ankle, 2 cases of heat-related illness, 1 infected blister that someone had ignored past the point of good sense, and a young specialist from the support team who'd had a panic attack at 2 in the morning and hadn't told anyone until she found him sitting against the outside wall of the medical bay, hands shaking, trying to breathe. She sat down on the ground next to him. She didn't bring him inside right away. She just sat there, and after about 4 minutes of silence, she said, "Tell me about somewhere cold, where you grew up, somewhere you've been, somewhere that isn't here." He looked at her sideways. "Minnesota," he said eventually. "We used to go ice fishing with my grandfather." "Tell me about that," she said. He did, haltingly at first, and then with more ease. And after about 15 minutes, his hands had stopped shaking and his breathing had evened out. She sat with him for another 10 minutes after that, not talking, just present. Then she helped him inside, documented it as a routine check, and sent him back to his bunk. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't file a referral that would have flagged him for evaluation and potentially ended his deployment. What she did file was a note in the base medical log recommending an increase in mental health check-in availability, framed as a general protocol improvement rather than a response to any specific incident. Voss read every medical log. He read that entry 3 times. He didn't say anything, but he noticed. The thing about watching someone work, really watching, not just registering their presence, was that you started to see things that didn't fit the category you'd put them in. Voss had been watching Brooke Aldridge for a week and a half, and the things that didn't fit were beginning to accumulate. The way she moved through the base, not the careful, slightly uncertain movement of a civilian navigating a military environment, but something more deliberate. The way her eyes swept a room when she entered it. Quick, systematic, returning to the exit points in the corners. The way she positioned herself in the communal areas, always with her back to a wall, never in the center of a space. The way she reacted to sounds. Normal people, even experienced contractors, still flinched at the sudden crack of a test fire or the rapid movement of armed men in close quarters. She didn't flinch. She oriented. There was a difference, and it was the difference between someone who was accustomed to startling sounds and someone who had been trained to process threat data quickly. He found himself watching her hands one evening at dinner. She was eating alone, reading something, and she'd placed her fork and knife with the handles toward her right side, where they would be immediately available. It was a small thing, a nothing thing, except it wasn't nothing, because normal people didn't do that, and trained people did it automatically, without thinking, because it had been drilled into their muscle memory until it was as natural as breathing. He sat down across from her. She looked up. She didn't look surprised exactly, but she adjusted. Something that was not quite a settling, not quite a readiness, but somewhere in between. "You were in," he said, no preamble. She looked at him steadily. "My badge says civilian contractor." "Your badge says what your paperwork says," he said. "I'm asking about you." Something moved through her expression. Not defensiveness, not the calculation of how much to reveal. Something older than that. The look of a person deciding how much of a true thing they were willing to confirm out loud. "I served," she said. "Where?" "Multiple theaters." "Branch." She held his gaze. "Why does it matter?" "Because," he said, "I've been operating for 16 years, and I've worked alongside a lot of people, and there are things a person does that aren't learned in a classroom and aren't inherited from watching others. They're earned, and you have those things." He paused. "So I'm asking, as the senior enlisted person responsible for this base's operational security, where did you serve?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Marines." He said nothing. "Lioness program," she said, before it was called anything official. Female engagement teams, forward presence, the work that wasn't acknowledged. He knew what that was. Anyone who knew anything about the early years in Iraq and Afghanistan knew what that was. Women attached to special operations units to engage with local female populations, gather intelligence, conduct searches, do the work that male operators couldn't do without causing incident. Work that was never classified as direct combat, legally and officially, because women weren't supposed to be in direct combat. Work that was, in reality, exactly that. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. "The shelf," he said finally. She raised an eyebrow slightly. "The way you reorganize the storage," he said, "tourniquets and pressure dressings at the front, airway management next, everything staged for a mass casualty event. That's not nursing school. That's field medicine under fire." "It's efficient," she said. "It's TCCC," he said. "Tactical Combat Casualty Care. The way it looks when someone has practiced it under pressure. Real pressure." She picked up her fork. "Is there a point to this conversation, Senior Chief?" He studied her. All of it. The stillness, the steadiness, the way she'd held her ground when he'd come at her in the medical bay. Not with aggression, but with something so settled that his aggression had had nothing to press against. "Not yet," he said. He stood up, looked at her one more time, then walked away without another word. That night, Brooke sat in her bunk for a long time without reading, without sleeping, just sitting with her hands in her lap in the dark. She thought about a hillside in Helmand Province. She thought about a woman named Torres, who had laughed at everything because she said if you stopped laughing, you'd start crying, and then you'd never stop. She thought about the weight of a rifle and the particular terrible clarity of a moment when everything you'd trained for becomes the only thing standing between the people you're responsible for and the thing coming toward you. She thought about the base administrator's briefing from 3 days ago, the one she wasn't supposed to have overheard because it was conducted quietly in the communications room with the door almost, but not completely closed. The report of increased activity from an armed group operating in the region. The intelligence assessment that put the likelihood of an attempted incursion at the base somewhere in the range of possible to probable within the next 2 weeks. She thought about the medical bay and the patients she already knew by name and the ones she hadn't met yet. She thought about Voss's face when she'd said the word Marines, the way his expression had shifted, not softened exactly, but recalibrated. She turned off her light. Outside, somewhere beyond the wire, something moved in the dark. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe it was nothing. In places like this, it was never quite possible to know the difference between the world settling and the world preparing. Either way, Brooke Aldridge slept lightly, as she always had, and her hands, even at rest, stayed close. The morning after Voss sat across from her at dinner, things were different. Not dramatically, not in any way that anyone who wasn't paying close attention would have caught, but the base ran on attention, and there were men on it who had made careers out of noticing the things that didn't announce themselves. Dylan noticed it first. The way Voss moved past the medical bay that morning without the usual deliberate avoidance, slowing almost imperceptibly as he passed the open door. Not stopping, not looking in, just slowing. Like a man recalculating something and not quite finished with the math. Dylan was inside helping Brooke restock the IV lines when it happened. She didn't look up from what she was doing, but she knew. He could tell she knew because her hands paused for exactly 1 second and then continued, and that pause was the only thing in her that ever gave anything away. "He's going to keep pulling at it," Dylan said. She handed him a bag of saline without looking at him. "Put those on the second shelf, left side. The fact that you won't talk about it," he continued, "it's going to become a thing." "It's already not a thing," she said. "Hand me the tourniquet rolls." He handed them over. "You know what he did last deployment?" 3 weeks in, one of the intel guys started acting cagey about his background. Voss ran a full, informal inquiry. Had the guy reassigned inside of 5 days. She finally looked at him. "Are you warning me?" "I'm informing you," he said. "There's a difference." She almost smiled. He'd used her own words back at her, and they both knew it. Something shifted in the air between them. Not warmth exactly, but the particular ease of two people who have recognized something in each other and decided, quietly, not to make a production of it. "Dylan," she said, setting down the supplies, "what do you know about the Lioness program?" He blinked. The shift was so abrupt it took him a second to follow it. "I know what it was. Female engagement teams. Iraq, Afghanistan." "Before it was official," she said. "Before anyone had figured out the right language for it. Before Congress had decided whether it was acceptable or not." She picked up the next box and cut it open with efficient precision. There were women going outside the wire on operations before any of that was formalized. Working with special operations units because the mission required it. No official combat designation, no recognition, no veterans' benefits that matched what the job actually was. He was quiet, listening in a way that felt different from the usual kind of listening. "And the ones who came home," she continued, "came home carrying the same weight as everyone else, without the same language to describe it, without the same support structure, without the same acknowledgement that what they'd survived was what it actually was." She put the box down, looked at him directly. "I'm not telling Voss anything," she said, "not because I'm hiding something dangerous, but because I spent 10 years having the things I did and the things I survived be officially described as something smaller than they were. I don't volunteer that anymore. I let the work speak." Dylan stood there for a moment with a bag of saline in each hand, looking at her. Then he nodded, once, slowly, the way young men nod when they've been told something that will take a while to fully land. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. She turned back to the shelf. And outside, somewhere beyond the open door, the base continued its morning. engines and voices, and the distant mechanical sound of equipment being prepped for another day. And none of it felt quite as ordinary as it had the day before. By midday, the intelligence report that Brooke had partially overheard through the almost closed door had been elevated. She knew this because she watched the way the base moved. The particular acceleration of purposeful activity, the way certain conversations stopped when she walked within earshot, the way Voss's platoon gathered for an unscheduled briefing at 1100 hours in the operations room with the door fully closed. She kept working. She restocked. She reviewed treatment records. She went over her mass casualty protocols again, not because she'd forgotten them, but because going over them was the right thing to do when the environment was shifting and you needed your hands to remember what your mind already knew. At 12:30, a young petty officer she hadn't formally met came into the bay with a cut on his forearm that had been carelessly bandaged in the field and needed proper attention. His name was Garrett. He was maybe 22. He sat on the table and watched her work with the look of someone who had been told something unsettling and was still processing it. "You hear anything?" he asked. Not specifically, the way people ask when they want confirmation of something they already suspect. She cleaned the wound without looking up. "I hear everything that happens in a medical bay," she said. "I don't hear operational briefings." "Right." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "We're moving to elevated readiness tonight. That's not classified, it's just..." "Garrett." "Yeah. How long have you been in?" 14 months. She pressed fresh gauze over the wound and held it with even pressure. "In 14 months, you've learned to prep your gear without being told twice. You've learned to sleep when you can, eat when you can, and think clearly when you can't do either. You've learned that the mission is the mission, and the feelings come later." She looked up at him. "Trust that. Trust what 14 months taught you. Worry is not preparation. Preparation is preparation." He looked at her for a long second. Something in his jaw released that he probably hadn't realized was tight. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she agreed. "Come back in 48 hours and let me check this." He slid off the table, paused at the door. "Are you scared?" he asked, like he genuinely needed to know, like her answer was data he required. She looked at him steadily. "I'm ready," she said. "That's better." He left. She stood at the counter for a moment after he was gone, her hands flat on the surface, her eyes on the middle distance. Then she pulled out her personal notebook, small, olive green, the kind you could get at any military supply, and wrote 3 lines in it. She closed it, put it in her breast pocket, and went back to work. At 1400 hours, Voss came back. He didn't knock. She didn't expect him to. He walked in and stood near the door, which he left open this time, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who had spent the last several hours deciding something and had arrived at a conclusion he wasn't entirely comfortable with. "I pulled every civilian contractor file from the last 5 years," he said. "Women with combat-adjacent deployments, military backgrounds, lioness connections." She set down what she was holding, gave him her full attention. "And there are about a dozen files that could plausibly be you," he said. "Different names, different cover identities, different posted locations. 3 of them have medical credentials attached." She said nothing. "One of them," he continued, "has a service record that was officially classified and then partially, not fully, partially, redacted. The name is different, but the physical description matches, and the operational theater history matches, and the list of medical qualifications matches." He paused. "And there's a commendation buried in it, a Silver Star commendation. The citation is redacted. The incident is redacted, but the word valor is in there twice in the parts that aren't." The room was very quiet. "Are you asking me something?" she said. "I'm telling you what I found," he said, "and I'm telling you that whatever that file belongs to, whoever that is, she pulled 3 people out of a burning vehicle under direct fire, performed emergency surgical intervention in the field without a sterile environment or proper equipment, and held a defensive position for 40 minutes until extraction arrived. His voice was different now, not softer, just different, like something that had been clenched had opened by a degree. 40 minutes. Alone. With a rifle she wasn't officially supposed to be carrying. Brooke looked at him, not with the flat steadiness she usually wore, with something beneath that. Something that looked, for just a moment, like the face of a person who had carried something very heavy for a very long time and had just felt someone else's hand on it. "That's a good story," she said. "It's not a story," he said. "No," she said quietly. "It's not." The air between them changed, not dramatically, not the way it changes in movies with a swell of music and a meaningful look sustained for too long. Just a small, real shift between two people who had been circling each other and had finally stopped. "Why the contract work?" he said, after a moment. Less confrontation in it now, more something closer to genuine. She looked at the shelf, at the tourniquets she'd moved to the front, at the trauma bags staged the way she'd staged them, because her hands knew how to do it before her brain finished the sentence. "Because I'm not done," she said. "And this is where the work is." He was quiet. Then he said, "The threat assessment was upgraded this morning. Intel puts a coordinated incursion attempt at probable within 72 hours. I'm briefing my platoon at 1600. He paused. "I want you in that briefing." She looked at him. Something moved in her expression that was not surprise, but was adjacent to it. The look of a person who had been told they are seen after a long time of being invisible. "I'll be there," she said. He nodded once, turned to go, stopped, turned back. "Aldridge." "Yeah." "The shelf reorganization," he said. "It was the right call." He walked out. She stood alone in the medical bay for a moment, with her hands at her sides, and she breathed in slowly and then breathed out. And something in her face that had been carefully controlled for weeks was, for just that moment, allowed to be something else. The briefing at 1600 was the most honest, professional gathering Brooke had been in since she'd left the service. Voss ran it tight, the way she would have expected. Intelligence summary, perimeter assessment, assigned positions, communication protocols, contingency actions if the wire was breached. He covered the medical piece with a precision that told her he'd thought about it before he walked in the room, which told her he'd been thinking about her role before he'd formally invited her to fill it. When he got to the trauma response protocol, he looked at her. "Aldridge runs the bay," he said, to the whole room. "Any casualty comes in, she has full authority. You do what she says, when she says it, without question. She will not ask twice." There were faces in that room she read quickly and completely. Acceptance, mild surprise, the particular careful neutrality of men who trusted Voss's judgment because he'd earned it. One face in the back right corner showed something else. Petty Officer First Class Harlan, who had been at the base longer than anyone and who had the specific resentment of a man who has settled into a hierarchy and doesn't enjoy having it rearranged. She filed it, moved on. After the briefing, Dylan fell into step beside her as she walked back toward the bay. "How do you feel?" he asked. "The same way I always feel," she said. "Focused. You know, half those guys just heard Voss say your name like you're one of us." "I heard it too," she said. "Does it?" He stopped himself. She glanced at him. "Does it what?" "I don't know," he said. "Does it mean something? After all the time of being, I don't know, treated like—" "Dylan," she said, and her voice was not unkind. "The meaning was always there. The acknowledgement is just useful. Logistically." She paused. "Don't let anyone else's recognition be the thing that tells you who you are. By the time it arrives, you should already know." He walked quietly beside her for a few steps. "That's going to take me a while," he admitted. "It took me a while too," she said. At 1800 hours, as the base moved into the tighter vigilance of elevated readiness, Brooke sat in the medical bay and opened the olive green notebook. She didn't write in it. She just looked at the 3 lines she'd written that afternoon and read them the way you read things that are true and important and need to be held in your mind rather than just known. The first line was the name of a woman she'd served with in Helmand, Torres. The second was a number, 42. The number of patients she had treated in the field during her time with the Lioness teams. The third was a sentence she'd written for herself when she'd left the service and needed something to carry forward. She read it now in the pale light of the medical bay, with the base settling around her into the particular taut stillness of a place that knows something is coming. Harlan appeared in the doorway at 1900. She looked up. He leaned against the frame with his arms crossed, in the way of a man who has decided to make a point through body language before he's even opened his mouth. "So Voss put you in the briefing," he said. "He did," she said. "Interesting call," he said, "given that you're a contract nurse." She set down her pen. "What can I do for you, Petty Officer Harlan?" "Just making conversation," he said. But he wasn't. She knew the difference. She'd met Harlan before, not him specifically, but the type. The man who had positioned himself carefully in a system and felt the system shift and didn't like what it meant for his footing. "I've been on this base 8 months," he said. "I've seen 4 contract medics come through. None of them were put in operational briefings. Then 4 contract medics came through who were not evaluated the same way," she said. "That's a decision Voss made. Take it up with him." "I might," he said. "Good," she said. "Was there something medical you needed?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what I think?" "I think you're going to tell me regardless," she said. His jaw tightened. "I think you said something to him. Made some play. People like you come into environments like this and figure out real fast how to make themselves look indispensable." She looked at him, fully, the way she looked at things she was assessing. He held her gaze for about 2 seconds before something in him registered that this was not going the way he'd expected and started recalculating. "People like me," she said without heat. "Contractors," he said. "Civilians." She stood up. She wasn't tall. She didn't make a production of standing, but something changed in the room, in the way that rooms change when the person in them stops operating in a lower register and allows what's actually there to become visible. "Harlan," she said, "in about 48 hours, maybe less, this base is going to be tested. And when that happens, the only thing that will matter in this room is whether the person next to you knows what they're doing." She picked up her pen. "I know what I'm doing. I've known what I'm doing for a long time, in places that would have ended most careers. So I would encourage you to take whatever this is," she gestured between them briefly, "and put it somewhere useful before you need to." He stared at her. She sat back down and opened her notebook. He stood there for another moment, and then he left. She heard his footsteps going down the corridor, fast at first, then slowing as something caught up with him. She didn't know what it was. She didn't need to. At 2200, she did her final checks. Bag positioned, trauma supplies laid out in the sequence she could execute blind, which she drilled until her hands knew the order without her looking. She checked the medical radio. She checked her own physical state, the things you check when you've learned to treat your own body as equipment. Hydration, food consumed, rest banked. She thought about Torres again. She thought about the hillside and the burning vehicle, and the 40 minutes and the weight of a rifle in her hands, and the sound her own breathing made when everything was very loud, and also somehow very clear. She was not afraid. She'd made peace with fear a long time ago, not by defeating it, but by understanding what it was for. Fear was data. It told you what was real and what mattered and where to put your attention. You used it. You didn't let it use you. Outside, the night was settling hard and dark over the base. The perimeter team was at full strength, every position manned, every frequency open. And somewhere in the grid of structures and wire and dark African night, something was moving that didn't belong there, getting closer with the particular patience of people who had planned carefully and were not in a hurry because they believed the thing they were moving toward was not ready for them. They were wrong about that, but they didn't know it yet. It came at 0217, not with a warning, not with the kind of gradual escalation that gives you time to settle into what's happening. It came the way the worst things always come, all at once, from multiple directions, with a violence that was designed specifically to overwhelm the gap between sleeping and ready. The first explosion hit the eastern perimeter. The second hit 4 seconds later, northwest corner. Brooke was already off her cot before the echo of the first one finished moving through the air. Not because she'd been waiting for it exactly, but because some part of her had never fully gone to sleep. That part had been listening for the past 3 nights without being asked to, the way it always did in places where listening was the difference between what happened next being manageable or catastrophic. She was pulling on her boots when the radio on her table crackled and Voss's voice came through, flat and controlled and fast. All positions, breach confirmed eastern perimeter, 2 entry points. We have contact. Aldridge, bay is hot. Stand by for incoming. She keyed the radio. Bay is ready. Standing by. She was already moving before she finished the sentence. The medical bay was 30 feet from her bunk. She covered it in less than 15 seconds. Hit the lights. Pulled the overhead cover panel she'd installed 3 days ago over the window. Not standard issue, just a reinforced tarp she'd rigged herself. Because the original window covering was inadequate, and she'd filed a maintenance request that hadn't been acted on, and so she'd acted on it herself. She moved to the trauma station. Everything where she'd put it, everything in sequence. Her hands confirmed each item without her eyes needing to look. Garrett came through the door at a run, 60 seconds after the second explosion. He had a pressure wound on his left shoulder, the kind that happens when you're moving fast, and a fragment finds the gap between your armor and your arm. He was coherent, mobile, eyes sharp despite the blood soaking through his sleeve. "Sit down," she said. "Tell me what it looks like out there." He sat, breathed hard. 3 confirmed breach points now. They're coordinated. Someone drew the northeast team out of position with the first explosion. Second one hit where the northeast team was supposed to be. Smart. His jaw was tight. Too smart. She had his sleeve cut away and was packing the wound before he finished the sentence. "How many shooters?" "At least 12 on the outside. Command thinks there may be a secondary element already inside the wire." Her hands didn't stop, but something behind her eyes went very still and focused. "Inside," she said. "That's what we're working with." "How long before?" The window covering absorbed the impact of something that was not a bullet. Heavier, faster, the particular sound of a fragment from a secondary device. The tarp held. She registered it, cataloged it, and kept her hands on Garrett's shoulder. "Pressure on that," she said, guiding his right hand to the packed wound. "Hold it firm. Don't let go." He pressed down without argument. "I'm good," he said. "I'm good, just—" "I know," she said. "Hold." Dylan came through the door next, and he had someone with him. Petty Officer Reyes, 26, training officer, who was walking on his own power but whose left leg was wrong in a way that was immediately visible. The kind of wrong that meant structural damage. The kind that could be managed if managed right, and catastrophic if managed wrong. Dylan had his arm and was taking the weight on the right side. "Femur?" she asked Dylan. "Don't know." He went down hard. Something hit the outside of the leg. "Get him on the second table." She was moving before she finished the sentence, running her hands down Reyes's leg with the practiced efficiency of someone who has assessed injuries in the dark, in the rain, with people shooting at her. Reyes hissed through his teeth. "Easy," she said. "I need you to tell me where the worst of it is." "Mid-thigh," Reyes said, tight. "Burns like—" "That's good," she said. "Burns means nerve response. Stay with me." She had the tourniquet positioned and applied with the speed and precision that 14 years of muscle memory produced. "Dylan, radio. I need a status on anyone else inbound to me." Dylan grabbed the secondary radio from the shelf where she'd placed it. He knew exactly where it was because she'd shown him twice in the past week, and he'd paid attention the way she'd hoped he would, and keyed it. Bay actual, what's the count incoming? Bay has 2, requesting status. The response came through, fractured and urgent. 2 more en route. Voss's voice underneath the static somewhere, directing fire, the particular cadenced authority of a man managing chaos through sheer force of will and experience. The door opened again. Harlan. She looked up. He was unhurt as far as she could assess at distance, but his face had the particular look of a man whose certainty had been knocked loose and not yet replaced with anything. He looked at the 2 men on her tables, at the speed and precision with which she was moving, and something in his expression shifted from the guarded hostility she'd seen in it the night before to something rawer and more honest. "What do you need?" he said. She didn't miss a beat. "Secondary 4 kit, top shelf right side. Set it up for Reyes. I'll tell you the rate." He moved, no hesitation. Whatever conversation they'd had the night before, whatever ground he'd been defending, he'd left it outside the door. She registered that without judgment. People were what they were under pressure, and under pressure, Harlan had chosen correctly. That was what mattered. The next 11 minutes were the fullest 11 minutes Brooke Aldridge had experienced in 4 years of civilian contract work. 2 more casualties arrived, 1 significant, 1 walking wounded who'd been sent back by Voss with instructions to get it looked at and return. She triaged on site, assessed with her hands, directed Harlan and Dylan with the clipped efficiency of someone who had run a trauma bay before, but not the kind that was in a hospital with clean floors and backup generators and the luxury of a single patient at a time. The significant casualty was bad. Young petty officer she hadn't formally met, name of Okafor, gunshot wound to the upper chest, left of center. Not the center mass kill zone, but close enough and deep enough that the mechanics of what was happening in there were not good. She had him on the table and her hands on him and was running through the assessment sequence in her head. Airway clear, breathing compromised, circulation compromised. The blood pressure drop she could feel in his radial pulse, telling her what the wound site confirmed. And she was making decisions faster than she could have explained them, the kind of decisions that exist below the level of language, and live in the place where training and experience and something harder to name all converge. "Harlan," she said, "right side of him. Left hand on that wound, press straight in, do not angle. Don't move, don't release." Harlan was there without a word. She watched his hands placed correctly on the first try and felt something open up in her chest that was not relief exactly, but was adjacent to it. The particular release of a person who has needed backup and found that the backup is competent. Dylan was at the radio. Medevac status? He was relaying for her, had been relaying for her since the second minute, reading what she needed before she said it. She'd been right about him from the first day. He had the instincts. The radio gave back what she'd feared. Medevac was 37 minutes out. The weather had pushed it. The LZ was not secure. 37 minutes. She looked at Okafor's face. He was conscious, which was both good and not good. Conscious meant his brain was getting blood. It also meant he could feel what was happening and was aware of how serious it was. And fear was a physiological event with real effects on the outcomes she was working against. She leaned down to his eye level. "Okafor, look at me." He looked at her. Wide eyes, the unfocused edge of shock beginning to creep in. "I have you," she said, directly, clearly, not soft, not performatively calm, just true. "I have done this before. I know exactly what's happening in there, and I know exactly what to do about it. You understand?" He held her gaze, nodded slightly. "Your only job right now is to breathe slow and stay with me. That's it. Can you do that?" "Yeah," he said, barely. "Good." She straightened up and went back to work. It was somewhere in the 18th minute that the door opened, and the world went sideways. She heard it before she fully processed it, the sound of the door moving not with the irregular urgency of a friendly casualty arriving, but with a different quality, deliberate, controlled. The way someone opens a door when they want to see what's inside before they're seen. She was turning before she'd consciously decided to turn, and what she saw was a man in the doorway who was not one of her people. Armed, rifle up, moving forward with the purpose of someone who had entered this building with a specific intention. He said something in Somali. She understood it. She had operational language proficiency in Somali from her time in the Lioness program. It was in her file, buried under the redactions, but it was there. He was telling her not to move. He was telling her to get on the floor. What he hadn't accounted for, what none of them ever accounted for, was the geography of the room. She had designed this room. She had reorganized every shelf, every table, every piece of equipment, and in doing that, she had mapped it the way she mapped every space she worked in, not just medically, logistically, where the sight lines were, where the choke points were, where someone entering from the primary door would have coverage, and where precisely that coverage had a gap. The gap was 3 feet to her left, behind the standing supply cabinet she had moved 4 days ago from the right wall to the left wall, nominally to improve workflow, actually because it created the gap. She moved into it in one step, not running, not dramatic, just a step and a turn, and she was behind the cabinet with her back to it and 2 feet of metal between her and his rifle. Harlan, to his credit, did not release Okafor. His hand stayed exactly where she'd put it. She registered that in half a second and felt something for him that she hadn't felt the night before. Dylan was at the far side of the room. She could hear him but not see him, and she needed to keep it that way, needed him not to move, needed him to understand without being able to tell him. The man moved forward. She could track his position by sound. She had always been able to track by sound. In Helmand, on the hillside, in the 40 minutes she never talked about, she had tracked 2 armed men through a structure she couldn't see by sound alone, and had made every correct decision there was to make. There was a secondary medical instrument tray to her left, heavy aluminum, intended for surgical tools. She picked it up. When he came around the cabinet, because he had to come around it, had to close the gap, there was no other option in the room. She met him with the tray edge on, hard across the inside of his forearm, and the rifle went down, and her knee came up, and then her elbow, and it was not graceful, and it was not the kind of thing that happens cleanly, but it was fast and certain, and the man went down, and the rifle was in her hands before he finished going down. The room was completely silent for 1 full second. Then Garrett, from the first table, still holding pressure on his own shoulder wound with one hand, said very quietly, "What in the entire—" "Stay down," she said. "Dylan, secure that door. Harlan, do not move your hand." Dylan moved to the door. Harlan didn't move his hand. She stood with the rifle and looked at the man on the floor, assessed him, 3 seconds, the same way she assessed everything, and then looked at her people, her patients, her bay. Okafor was still breathing. Reyes had his eyes open and was watching her with an expression that had moved past shock into something else entirely. Garrett's mouth was open. "Reyes," she said. "Yeah," he said like he was answering from a long way away. "Keep breathing slow," she said. "You're doing fine." Her voice was the same voice it always was, the one that didn't change registers based on what was happening, the one that Torres had called her superpower, back before the word superpower had become tired. "You could burn the whole world down," Torres had said, and she'd still sound like she was talking someone through a blood pressure check. The radio on the shelf crackled. "Voss. Bay, what is your status? I have a report of a secondary element inside the wire, unaccounted for." "Bay, respond." She keyed it with one hand, rifle in the other. "Bay is secure," she said. "1 hostile down, disarmed and restrained. 3 patients stable. Medevac timeline?" There was a pause. Then Voss's voice came back with a quality in it she hadn't heard from him before. Not surprise exactly, but something that had cracked open. 31 minutes, he said. You restrained a hostile. Affirmative. Another pause, shorter. Are you injured? Negative. Copy, he said. And then, after a beat that felt longer than it was, good work, Aldridge. She set the radio down, looked at Dylan, who was at the door, and staring at her with an expression she recognized. The look of someone whose framework for a person has just been replaced with a larger one. Stop staring, she said. Get me the restraint kit from the bottom shelf. He moved. She went back to Okafor. 29 minutes left. The next 29 minutes were the kind of time that expands and compresses simultaneously. The kind that you live through in a specific gear that is different from ordinary time, and that you remember afterward in a different way than you remember ordinary things. Every minute had a weight and a texture and a series of decisions inside it. She kept Okafor stable. She talked to him without stopping, not to comfort him, but because keeping him focused and responsive was a clinical decision with real effects on his blood pressure and his heart rate and his chances when the medevac team got their hands on him. She talked about nothing specific, about Minnesota actually, about ice fishing, the thing Garrett had described, which she brought back out now because it was the right kind of image, cold and quiet and far away. Okafor's eyes stayed on her. Harlan maintained pressure for the full duration, without complaint, without shifting, without releasing. His hand cramped. She could see it in his forearm, and he didn't say anything, and he didn't move. At one point, about 15 minutes in, he said quietly, just to her, I was wrong about you. She didn't look up from what she was doing. Focus on what your hand is doing. I know, he said. I just... Later, she said. Tell me later. He nodded, went quiet, kept his hand exactly where she'd put it. Dylan managed the radio and the door and the restrained man on the floor with a competence that told her everything about what he was going to be in 10 years. What he was already, really, if anyone was paying attention. He was calm in the way young people are calm when the training catches up with the moment and they discover that they are, in fact, what they've been working toward. Outside, the firefight moved through its phases. The initial, violent escalation, the period of brutal, sustained exchange, the beginning of the shift as Voss's platoon found its angles and started taking and holding ground, the gradual reduction of incoming fire that told her the people doing this had not fully prepared for what they were hitting. They had prepared for a forward operating base with a civilian contractor nurse and a team of SEALs who might be caught sleeping. They had not prepared for this particular team with this particular readiness or for what was in the medical bay. At minute 26, she heard something she'd been tracking without acknowledging. The change in the quality of gunfire outside. The reduction in volume, the shift in direction, the specific acoustic signature of a firefight that has turned decisively in one direction. At minute 31, exactly, the medevac team came through the door. She gave them Okafor's entire status in 40 seconds. Every number, every decision she'd made, every intervention and its timing, the current blood pressure and respiration, and the specific thing they needed to watch in the next 10 minutes. The lead medic, a woman, late 30s, who moved with the same economy Brooke moved with, listened without interrupting, asked one clarifying question, got one precise answer, and then took over the handoff with a seamlessness that was as close as two trained strangers could come to thinking with the same mind. As they moved Okafor out, he turned his head and looked at Brooke. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She watched them go. Then she turned back to her bay, to Garrett, who was coherent and stable, and staring at her. To Reyes, who needed her to look at his leg again now that the immediate crisis had passed. To Harlan, who had finally released pressure on Okafor and was flexing his cramped hand and looking at it like he wasn't quite sure what to do with himself. And to the man on the floor, restrained and disarmed, who was looking at her with an expression she'd seen before on the faces of people who had come into contact with something they had not anticipated and could not categorize. She looked back at him without heat. "You made a mistake about this room," she said, in Somali, precisely, cleanly. "It happens." His eyes widened. Dylan made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. Voss came through the door 9 minutes after the medevac left. He was still in full kit, rifle slung, and there was blood on his right forearm that she assessed immediately. Superficial, manageable, not the reason she needed to look at it less urgently than she was looking at his face. He stood in the doorway of the medical bay and looked at the room, at the evidence of what had happened in it, at the restrained man on the floor, at Harlan and Dylan and Garrett, at the blood and the empty packaging and the organized, controlled aftermath of a mass casualty event that had been managed by one person with backup she trained herself. He looked at Brooke. She was already moving toward him, not waiting for him to come to her. She stopped in front of him and looked at his arm. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He didn't argue. She worked on his arm. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The bay was settling around them, the specific decompression that happens when the acute phase ends and the bodies and the minds begin the long journey back towards something resembling ordinary. "Okafor?" he said. "Stable when they took him," she said. "The medic was good. He'll make it." Voss breathed out, a long breath, the kind that carries something with it. "The hostel in my bay," she said, without looking up from his arm. "I need you to know it was contained. No one else in the bay was in danger after the first 30 seconds. "I know," he said. "I used the rifle to secure the room, and then I put it down," she said. "I want that in whatever report gets written." He looked at her. She was still working on his arm, precise and methodical. "Aldridge," he said. "Yeah. What I said in the briefing," he said, "about your authority in this bay." "I remember it," she said. "I want you to know," he said, "that it wasn't a concession. It wasn't me doing you a courtesy." He paused. "It was accurate. It was just accurate. And I should have said it on day one instead of—" He stopped. She tied off the last of the bandage and pressed it smooth. "Marcus," she said. His first name. She'd never used it before. He registered it. "You protected what you were responsible for, and then you recalibrated when the information changed. That's not something to apologize for." She picked up her equipment and turned back to the bay. "That's the job." He sat there for a moment, looking at the wrap on his arm, and then he stood up, and when he looked at her, there was something in his face that hadn't been there before. Not gratitude exactly, something more specific than that. The particular look of a person who has revised their understanding of the world and found it larger and truer than it was before. Dylan was watching from across the bay. He caught Brooke's eye and she caught his, and she gave him nothing but a brief, slight nod, the smallest possible version of everything it needed to contain, and he received it the way he received everything she gave him, quietly, completely, and without wasting it. Outside, the base was breathing hard and uneven in the way things breathe after impact. Voices, movement, the specific, organized chaos of aftermath being processed by trained people. The eastern perimeter was being secured. The secondary element was accounted for. The count of the team was complete. Everyone was alive. Brooke stood in the center of her bay and looked at what the last 2 hours had made of the room she'd prepared, and she felt the specific feeling that she had no clean word for, the one that came after the worst of it was over and the people you were responsible for were still breathing. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't relief. It was something older and quieter than both of those things, something that didn't require a name to be real. She picked up Torres's name from the front of her mind, held it for a moment, and then let it settle back to where she kept it. Close. Always close. Then she reached for the supply shelf and started preparing for whatever came next. The after-action report took 4 hours to write and 2 days to fully process. which was the way it always went when the thing that had happened was larger than the paperwork designed to contain it. Voss wrote his portion at the field desk in the operations room with the kind of focused precision he brought to everything. And when he got to the section describing the medical bay incident, he stopped for a long time and looked at the wall before he wrote a single word. He didn't dramatize it. He wasn't built for dramatics on paper. He wrote what happened factually and completely. The breach, the secondary element, the hostile who had entered the medical bay, and the actions of the contracted civilian trauma nurse who had disarmed and restrained that hostile, while simultaneously managing 3 critical casualties and maintaining the stability of all of them until medevac arrival. He wrote it precisely and without embellishment because the facts were already more than enough. He submitted the report at 0600. By 0800, he had a response from his command asking for clarification on one line. The line that described Brooke as having spoken to the restrained hostile in Somali. Voss read the response twice. Then he walked to the medical bay. She was cleaning. Not in the frantic way of someone processing trauma through activity, but in the methodical, thorough way she did everything. Working through the bay in sections, restoring order, cataloging what needed to be restocked and what needed to be replaced, and what had been damaged in ways that weren't immediately obvious but would matter later. She had a clipboard in one hand and a cleaning cloth in the other, and she was moving with the same steady efficiency as always, as if the last 9 hours had been an ordinary shift and not the kind of night that rewrote people. Voss stood at the door for a moment before she acknowledged him. He wasn't sure whether she'd heard him and was making a point or genuinely hadn't, and the fact that he couldn't tell was itself information about her. Somali, he said. She didn't stop what she was doing. I tested at professional working proficiency in 2009, she said. Operational necessity. The Lioness program required language capability in the regions we were assigned. Your file doesn't show that. My file shows what was allowed to be in my file, she said, which was not everything in my file. He walked in and sat on the edge of the supply table she wasn't currently using. It was the first time she could remember him sitting in the medical bay without it being because she'd told him to. Command wants a full debrief, he said. Not just the report, a formal debrief. Someone is coming out from Djibouti. She looked up at that. When? 48 hours. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded and went back to what she was doing. Aldridge, he said. Marcus, is there anything in your background that is going to create a problem for this base when that debrief happens? She stopped, turned to face him fully. There was something careful in his voice, not accusatory, not hostile, but careful in the way of a man who is asking a real question because he genuinely needs the real answer and not a managed version of it. No, she said, there's nothing in my background that creates a problem for anyone. There are things in my background that were deliberately made difficult to find. That's different. Why were they made difficult to find? She looked at him for a long moment. Then she set the clipboard down, crossed her arms and told him something she had not told anyone in 4 years. She told him about the Helmand incident, not in full detail, not the 40 minutes, not the burning vehicle, not all of it, but enough. She told him about the Silver Star commendation that had been awarded and then classified and then partially redacted, not because the action hadn't warranted it, but because the official acknowledgement of it would have required the official acknowledgement of what she'd been doing there, which would have required the official acknowledgement of a program that certain people in certain positions still wanted described in smaller terms than it actually was. She told him that she had accepted the classification without fighting it, because fighting it would have required a public argument that would have cost people she cared about their careers, and she had decided that was not a trade she was willing to make. Voss listened without speaking. His expression didn't change dramatically, but she watched the subtle shifts in it, the thing that tightened around his eyes when she described the Helmand hillside, the thing that moved through his jaw when she described the classification process, the thing that was not quite anger, but was in the same neighborhood as anger and was, she thought, directed not at her. When she finished, the bay was quiet for a moment. They buried it, he said, flat. They minimized it, she said. There's a bureaucratic difference. Not to me, he said. She looked at him. Something moved through her. Not the familiar ache of the injustice itself, which she had long since made peace with, in the way you make peace with things that can't be changed, but something warmer. The specific feeling of being seen correctly by a person whose opinion of accuracy you respect. It's done, she said. I'm not looking to relitigate it. The debrief might relitigate it whether you want it to or not, he said. If whoever is coming from Djibouti pulls a full file and finds the redactions, they're going to have questions. Then I'll answer them, she said. I want to be in the room, he said. She blinked. It was the closest thing to genuine surprise she had shown since arriving at the base. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said. I want to be in the room. He held her gaze. You ran a 3-casualty bay, neutralized a hostile threat, maintained patient stability through a medevac handoff, and did it all while a firefight was happening 30 meters from your door. If someone from Djibouti is going to sit across from you and ask questions about your background, I want someone in that room who was here. Who knows what this base looks like when it's been tested and what it looks like because of what you did? He paused. I want to be that person. She looked at him for a long time. Okay, she said quietly. Okay, Marcus. Dylan found her that afternoon sitting outside the bay on the ground, her back against the wall, her knees up, the olive green notebook open on her thigh. She wasn't writing, she was just sitting with it open. He lowered himself to the ground beside her without being invited, and she didn't tell him to leave, which he'd learned to read as an invitation. How's Reyes? He asked. He'll keep the leg, she said. Hairline fracture in the femur, soft tissue damage. He'll be off the line for 8 weeks minimum, but he'll keep the leg and he'll come back full function if he does the rehab correctly. And Garrett? 2 days and he'll be angry he's not on operations, she said, which means he's fine. Dylan nodded, looked out at the middle distance. The base was in the slow, effortful process of reassembling itself, repairs to the perimeter, equipment being assessed and replaced, the particular post-incident energy of a place that had been through something and was deciding what to do with it. I've been thinking about what you said, he said, about not letting someone else's recognition tell you who you are. She waited. I'm not sure I'm there yet, he said, but I think I understand what the destination looks like now, better than I did. She closed the notebook. You made good decisions last night. In the bay, the radio, the door, the way you position yourself without being told. Those were judgment calls and they were right. He was quiet for a moment. I was scared, he said. I want to be honest about that. Good, she said. If you hadn't been scared, you wouldn't have been paying attention. He turned to look at her. Were you scared? She thought about it genuinely, the way she thought about real questions. There's something that happens in those moments, she said slowly, that isn't exactly fear and isn't exactly calm. It's like everything gets very specific, very immediate. It's almost a relief in a way that's hard to explain, because all of the other things, the things you carry around normally, the weight of history, the things you're worried about, they fall away. And there's just the problem in front of you and what you know how to do about it. She paused. The fear is there, but it goes into the fuel. He sat with that. Torres, he said. She'd mentioned the name once, quietly, in a way she probably hadn't realized he'd caught. Who was she? The pause was long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, the best person I've ever known, and the person who made me believe I could be useful in situations where everyone else was focused on survival. She looked at the notebook in her hands. She laughed at everything, even the things that weren't funny, especially the things that weren't funny. Something in her voice shifted, not breaking, just carrying weight. She said that the opposite of fear wasn't courage, it was clarity, knowing exactly who you are and what you're for, clearly enough that even the worst situations can't make you forget it. Dylan was very still beside her. She didn't come home, she said. It was simple and complete, the whole shape of the thing in 6 words. I'm sorry, he said, also simple, also complete. She nodded once. Then she opened the notebook again and wrote 1 line and closed it. Go eat something, she said, and check on Garrett. He's going to start complaining within the hour, and someone should be there to appreciate it. He stood up, paused. Brooke. She looked up. He almost never used her first name. Thank you, he said, for what you did last night, for all of it, not just last night. He stopped like he was going to say more, and then decided that what he'd already said was what needed to be said. She held his gaze. Go eat, Dylan. He went. The man from Djibouti arrived 39 hours after Voss sent the report. His name was Commander Whitfield, and he was in his early 50s, naval intelligence background, with the particular manner of someone who had spent his career asking questions of people who didn't particularly want to answer them, and had become very good at finding the truth in the gaps between what was said and what wasn't. He was not unkind. He was thorough in the way that is more unsettling than hostility. He set up in the operations room and brought 2 junior officers with him and a recording device that he placed on the table with the specific neutrality of a man making a bureaucratic gesture that both parties understood was not actually neutral. Voss was in the room. He sat to Brooke's left and slightly behind her, which was a deliberate positioning, present, visible, not interfering. She registered it without acknowledging it. Whitfield went through the incident report first, point by point. She confirmed each point with the same brevity she'd brought to every professional interaction since arriving at the base. And he took his time at each one, and at each point of hesitation, she held the silence without filling it, because she had learned a long time ago that the instinct to fill silence during a formal inquiry was a trap. He got to the Somali. Your contractor file lists English and Spanish as your language capabilities, he said. My contractor file is not a complete representation of my capabilities, she said. Where did you acquire professional working proficiency in Somali? Through a language training program attached to the operational unit I was assigned to between 2008 and 2011. That unit being a female engagement team operating in conjunction with Special Operations Forces in Afghanistan and on 2 occasions in adjacent regions. She held his gaze. The records of that program are classified. Some of them are partially redacted. The redactions were not my decision. Whitfield looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the folder in front of him, a physical folder, which told her he'd done his preparation in paper form, which told her he took security seriously, which told her more about his thoroughness than anything he'd said. There's a commendation in here, he said, partially redacted. I'm aware of it, she said. The unredacted portions describe an action under direct fire, he said. Vehicle extraction, field surgical intervention, sustained defensive position. He paused. The citation uses the word valor twice. I'm aware of what it says, she said. Were you aware, he said more carefully, that a request was filed in 2014 to upgrade the classification level of that commendation and make it a matter of public record? She looked at him. Her expression didn't change. But something behind it did. I was not aware of that, she said. It was denied, he said. The denial was filed by a senior officer in the program's oversight structure. That officer retired in 2017. He paused again. The denial was reviewed by a different oversight office in 2022. That review recommended reversal. He looked up from the folder. The reversal was approved. It was approved in 2022. The administrative process for notification was, he paused, and for the first time there was something in his voice that was not pure procedure, not completed. The room was quiet. Voss, behind her and to her left, did not move, but she could feel the quality of his stillness change. "Are you telling me," she said, and her voice was level, but her voice was doing work, "that the reversal of the classification was approved 4 years ago?" "Yes," Whitfield said, "and I was not notified." "You were not notified," he said. "I can't speak to why the notification process wasn't completed. What I can tell you is that as of this conversation, you are aware of it." She sat with that for a moment. 4 years. The commendation had been unclassified for 4 years, and she had been carrying the classified version of her own history in the same place she always carried it, close, private, at a cost she had decided was acceptable. And it hadn't needed to cost that. For 4 years, it hadn't needed to cost that. Something moved through her that she didn't immediately have a name for. It wasn't anger, though anger was in it. It wasn't relief, though relief was also somewhere in it. It was something that sat between those two things and had weight. "There's a second item," Whitfield said. His voice had shifted, not softer, but different. "There is a proposal attached to this file, submitted through my office before I came here. It concerns a formal integration program for personnel with backgrounds like yours, Lioness veterans, female engagement team members, individuals with combat-adjacent experience whose official records don't reflect their actual operational value." He looked at her steadily. "The proposal names you specifically, as a case study and as a potential program advisor." She looked at him. "Who submitted it?" she said. Whitfield glanced at the folder. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Voss," he said, "submitted at 0700 the morning after the incident." The silence that followed had a texture to it. She turned her head and looked at Voss. He was looking at the wall, not avoiding her gaze. She'd seen him avoid things he didn't want to deal with, and this wasn't what that looked like. He was giving her the moment, giving her space to absorb it without his face in the way. She turned back to Whitfield. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were clear. Her voice, when it came, was exactly the voice it always was. Steady and grounded, and fundamentally bedrock certain. "I'll need to read the proposal in full," she said. "Of course," Whitfield said, "and I'll have questions." "I would expect nothing less," he said. And there was something in his expression then, brief, controlled, but genuine, that told her he had come prepared for this version of the conversation and was not displeased to be having it. Garrett was out of the medical bay by the time she got back to it. She'd predicted correctly. He was on his feet and moving, and deeply, vocally irritated about the restrictions on his activity, which was exactly the right kind of recovery trajectory. Dylan had apparently been there for the complaining phase, as she'd suggested, and by his expression when she walked in, it had been extensive. "Everything okay?" he asked. She set her jacket on the table. "Complicated," she said, "but okay." He waited. She looked at him. "The commendation," she said, "the one that was classified." "Yeah, it was declassified 4 years ago," she said. "I wasn't told." Dylan's expression moved through 3 things in fast succession. 4 years, he said. 4 years, she confirmed. He opened his mouth, and she saw the anger forming in him, the young man's righteous, clean anger on behalf of something unjust. And she shook her head slightly, not dismissively, just enough. "It's done," she said. "It was done 4 years ago. What wasn't done was someone telling me. That's a process failure. I'm going to be angry about it for exactly as long as it takes me to figure out what to do with the information going forward." She picked up the clipboard she'd left on the counter. "Right now that means reading a proposal and deciding whether I want to be a part of something larger." She paused. "Which I think I do." Dylan was quiet for a moment, then something settled in his face. "Good," he said, like the word had been waiting there. She began her supply review. He helped without being asked, the way he'd started doing somewhere in the second week, natural and unannounced, like it was simply what he did now. They worked in the comfortable silence of two people who had decided, each in their own way and on their own timeline, that they trusted each other. Reyes appeared in the doorway an hour later, on crutches. One of the hospital-issue aluminum kind that someone had scrounged up from somewhere, and he stood there with the expression of a man who had a lot he wanted to say and wasn't sure which part to lead with. "How's the leg?" she said without looking up. "It hurts like you would not believe," he said. "That's correct," she said. "That's what a hairline femoral fracture feels like. Come in, sit, let me look at it." He came in and sat. She examined it efficiently and confirmed what she already knew. Healing on track, pain appropriate and expected, the specific kind of discomfort that means things are going right rather than wrong. "I need to tell you something," he said while she worked. "Okay," she said. When that man came in the door," he said, "I was on the table. I couldn't do anything. I was watching everything from there." He paused. "I've seen things. I've been in situations, but I've never, the way you moved. It wasn't," he stopped, tried again. "You moved like you'd already decided, like the whole room was already mapped, and you knew exactly where every piece of it was and what it was for, and you just," he shook his head. "I've trained with some of the best operators in the world, and I'm telling you I have not seen that kind of calm, that kind of absolute certain calm." She pressed the edge of the wrap and checked the pressure. "You were good on that table," she said. "You kept your breathing controlled. That mattered." "That's not what I'm talking about," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm talking about what you are," he said. "What you actually are, not what the badge says." She looked up at him then and held his gaze with the straightforward, undefended steadiness that was the most honest thing about her. "I'm a nurse," she said, "who has been other things, and who found that the other things in the nursing were actually the same thing, when it came down to it. Both of them are about keeping people alive." She held his gaze. "That's all I've ever been trying to do." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, slowly, fully, the way people nod when the words they've heard are going to settle into them and stay. Voss found her that evening. She was outside again, same spot as the day before. Notebook closed in her hands this time, rather than open. He sat down beside her without ceremony, which was new, the ease of it, the naturalness. Something had changed between them in the debrief room, and they both knew it, and neither of them felt the need to say so. "Did you read it?" she asked. "The proposal? I wrote it." "I mean, did you read it as something I would read it?" she said. "Knowing what I know about why things like this get written and what happens to them afterward." He considered that seriously. "I wrote it because it's right," he said, "because there are people in positions exactly like the one you've been in, doing the work, carrying the weight, being officially invisible. And the only way that changes is if someone who was there builds the argument for why it should change. And if the argument gets filed and classified," she said, "then someone files it again," he said, "and again." She looked at him. "You sound very certain about that." "I've been doing this for 16 years, he said. "The only things that change are the things someone keeps pushing on. Everything else stays exactly where it is." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Torres would have liked you." He didn't ask who Torres was. She'd used the name twice now where he could hear it, and he was perceptive enough to have built an understanding of the shape of it without being told. "Yeah," he said. "She had zero patience for anyone who wasted words," she said. "You don't waste words." "Neither do you," he said. They sat for a while in the quiet of a base that was healing around them. The specific, effortful, real quiet of a place that had been tested and held. Not unscathed, not unchanged, but held. After a while, she said, "The proposal, the program advisor role." "Yeah," he said. "I'll do it," she said, "with conditions." "What conditions?" "That it's built to serve the people who need it, she said, not to serve the institution that should have built it 15 years ago. Voss was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Those are conditions I can work with." She nodded, looked out at the darkening. Somewhere on this base there was a young petty officer named Garrett who would be back on operations within the week and would carry what happened in the medical bay inside him in the way that things you've survived become part of your architecture. There was a young man named Dylan who was going to be extraordinary and was already beginning to understand the shape of what that meant. There was a petty officer named Reyes who would do his rehab and come back full strength and would remember for the rest of his career what it had looked like to watch someone operate from absolute clarity. There was Harlan, who had held his hand in place for 30 minutes when it cramped and hadn't moved it, and was carrying that knowledge of himself forward into whatever came next. And there was Okafor, somewhere in a hospital in Djibouti, alive. That was the number that mattered. That was the count that she carried with her, the way she'd always carried it. Not the times things had gone wrong, and things had gone wrong over the years, in the ways that they go wrong in the world she'd lived in, and she carried those too. But the ones who had made it. The ones who were alive because of what she knew, and what she'd done, and who she had chosen to be, in room after room, in the dark, when no one was watching or when everyone was watching, and it made no difference. She opened the olive green notebook, looked at the 3 lines she'd written over the course of the last several days. Then she wrote a 4th, closed it, put it back in her breast pocket where it lived. Voss glanced at her. "What do you write in that thing?" "Names," she said, "and numbers, and 1 sentence." He waited to see if she'd say more. She didn't. He let it go, the way he was learning to let the things go that she held privately, because he'd come to understand that she didn't hold them from fear or from damage, but from the specific care of a person who knows exactly what deserves to be protected. The base breathed around them. Night was coming in hard and dark, and full of the ordinary unknown that every night was in a place like this. And Brooke Aldridge sat with her back against the wall and her notebook against her chest, and felt, in a way she hadn't let herself feel in a long time, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was built to do, beside people who finally, fully knew it. 3 days after the debrief, Okafor called from Djibouti. He called the base medical line at 0900, and Brooke picked up on the second ring the way she picked up everything. Immediately, fully present, no transition time between whatever she'd been doing and the full weight of her attention on the phone. "This is Aldridge," she said. There was a pause, then a voice, still thin at the edges from what his body had been through, but recognizably his. "It's Okafor," he said. "Ma'am." She sat down, not because she needed to, just because the moment seemed to call for it. "How are you feeling?" she said. "Like someone fixed a hole in my chest," he said, "which I'm told is exactly what happened." Another pause. "The doctor here said the field intervention, the way the wound was managed before medevac, that's why I'm talking to you right now. He said whoever did it knew what they were doing at a level he doesn't usually see outside a surgical suite." She was quiet. "I wanted to say thank you," he said. I know it doesn't cover it, but I needed to say it." "You stayed with me," she said, "in the bay. You kept your breathing controlled and you stayed present. That matters more than people realize. You did your part." He made a sound that was almost a laugh but carried too much weight to be only that. "I was terrified," he said. "I know," she said. "You did it anyway. That's the whole thing, Okafor. That's the entire definition of what this is." He was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. She could hear the hospital sounds behind him, the particular ambient texture of a military medical facility, machines and voices, and the specific hum of a place dedicated to putting people back together. "Will you still be there when I come back?" he asked. She looked at the medical bay around her, at the reorganized shelves, the staged trauma bags, the secondary radio Dylan had positioned exactly where she'd shown him, the supply cabinet that sat 3 feet to the left of where it had been when she arrived, and that had, on one specific night, made all the difference. "Yeah," she said, "I'll be here." She hung up and sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she put it down, picked up her clipboard, and went back to work. Dylan found out about the call from Garrett, who had overheard part of it through the bay's thin interior wall, while coming to have his sutures checked for the third time that week, which was twice more than medically necessary, but which Brooke permitted because she understood that his real reason for coming was not the sutures. She understood that he was processing what had happened by staying close to the place where it happened, and that this was a legitimate form of processing, and that the appropriate response was to check his sutures without comment and let him sit for a few minutes before sending him back to his day. Dylan came to find her at midday. He had the look of someone who had been thinking hard about something and had reached a conclusion he wanted to verify. "Okafor's going to be okay," he said, not a question. "He's going to be fully okay," she said, "because of what you did in the bay. Because of what everyone in the bay did," she said, "including him." Dylan sat on the edge of the table. He had the olive green notebook in his hand. She looked at it, then looked at him, with the particular stillness of a person who is not going to react with anger, but is waiting for an explanation. "It was on the counter," he said immediately. "I wasn't going through your things. I was restocking the left shelf and I knocked it and it fell open." He held it out to her. "I only saw one thing. I wasn't trying to." She took it, looked at him steadily. "What did you see?" He hesitated, then he said, "The sentence. The one you said you wrote for yourself when you left the service." She held the notebook, did not open it. "It says," he started. "I know what it says," she said. "Do the people you saved know who they are to you?" he said quietly. "Is that what it means?" She looked at him for a long moment. The sentence in the notebook, the one Torres had effectively written for her without knowing it, the one that had been Brooke's North Star through 4 years of contract work and 2 decades of service before that, was hers. Private. The kind of thing a person writes for themselves and not for anyone else. But Dylan had seen it, and he'd understood it. And the fact that he'd understood it meant something she hadn't anticipated feeling. "Every person I've ever treated," she said carefully, "was someone to somebody. A son or a daughter or a partner or a friend. Someone was holding their breath somewhere in the world, waiting to find out whether the person they loved was coming home." She held his gaze. "That's what I carry with me into the bay. That's what I think about when I'm making decisions under pressure. Not the clinical data alone, the weight of who the person is. What it would mean for the world if they didn't make it." She paused. "That's what the sentence means." Dylan was very still. He looked like a young man in the process of having something essential clarified. Not told to him for the first time, but clarified, sharpened, brought into focus in a way that would not leave. "I want to be the kind of person who carries that," he said, "the way you carry it." "You already are," she said. "You just haven't tested the full weight of it yet. The testing is coming. When it does, you'll know." He nodded, stood, then turned back with one more thing, the way he always had one more thing. "Voss told the team," he said, "about the commendation, about Helmand, about what you did and what happened afterward." He watched her face. "I don't know if you knew he was going to do that." She hadn't. She held that information for a moment without showing it. "How did the team take it?" she said. "Garrett cried," Dylan said. "He'll never admit that if you ask him, but I was standing right there." He paused. Harlan apologized to someone who wasn't in the room. Just kind of said it out loud, to himself, standing by the vehicle bay. "I don't think he knew I could hear him." He looked at her. The rest of them just got quiet. The specific kind of quiet that happens when something is wrong and the wrongness has finally been named. She breathed in slowly and then out. "And you?" she said. "I was angry for about an hour," he said. "And then I thought about what you told me about Torres, about clarity, about knowing who you are clearly enough that even the worst situations can't make you forget it." He shook his head slightly. And I thought, she knew. The whole time. She carried it and she knew and she kept showing up anyway, and that's... He stopped. That's not a story about injustice. That's a story about someone who decided what they were for and then was it, completely, regardless of whether anyone gave them permission. She looked at him for a long, full moment. "Go eat," she said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not quite. He went. The second twist came on day 5, and it came the way the first one had. Not announced, not with time to prepare. Whitfield called from Djibouti at 1400. She took the call in the operations room with Voss present, and Whitfield's voice on the other end of the line had a different quality from the debrief. Less procedural, more direct. Like a man who had been operating through official channels and had decided the official channels were moving too slowly for what needed to happen. "The proposal Voss submitted," he said, "has been fast-tracked." She looked at Voss. He was watching her with a steady expression. "Fast-tracked to what level?" she said. "Theater command," Whitfield said. "There is significant interest. More than I anticipated, honestly, and I anticipated significant interest." A pause. "There are 14 individuals who fit the profile your case established. Women with lioness or FET backgrounds, combat-adjacent service records, skills that are officially underdocumented. Several of them are currently in contractor roles similar to yours. Several have left the service and gone quiet." He paused again. "We'd like you to help find them." The room was very quiet. "Find them," she said. "Help us locate them, speak to them, because you can have a conversation with these women that a naval intelligence officer cannot have. You know what it was. You lived it. And the program we're trying to build isn't going to work if it's built by people who are theorizing about an experience they haven't had." His voice was clear and unambiguous. "It needs to be built by someone who knows exactly what it cost and exactly what it was worth." She stood at the table with the phone in both hands and felt something moving through her that she recognized from only a handful of moments in her life. The specific internal rearrangement that happens when the thing you've been doing and the thing the world needs turn out to be the same thing, and the world finally admits it. "What's the timeline?" she said. "We'd want you in Djibouti within 2 weeks to begin initial consultations," he said. "Your position at this base would be extended and your clearance upgraded. The contract would be reclassified." He paused. "And the Silver Star commendation will be formally entered into the public record. That process has already been initiated." Voss was watching her. She was looking at the wall. "One condition," she said. "Name it," Whitfield said. "I finish my rotation here first," she said. "Properly. Whatever the timeline says, I'm here until my people are stable and the base is at full operational readiness. I'm not leaving mid-rotation." A pause. 4 weeks, Whitfield said. "That's what full readiness looks like on our end too. 4 weeks." "Then yes," she said. "I'll be in Djibouti in 4 weeks." She set the phone down, stood at the table, did not immediately move or speak. Voss said, "Aldridge." She turned. 14, he said, the number Whitfield had mentioned. "The women." 14, she confirmed. "There are more than 14, he said. You know that." "I know that," she said. 14 is where it starts." He nodded, and in his expression was the thing she'd watched develop over the past 2 weeks. The steady, committed respect of a man who had been a skeptic and had been proven wrong and had responded to being proven wrong by becoming the strongest advocate in the room. Not because it made him look good, because it was right. And Voss, whatever his flaws, could not persist in being wrong once he understood the truth of a thing. "The team should know," he said, "about Djibouti." "You already told them about Hellman," she said, a slight edge in her voice but not a sharp one. "I told them what they needed to hear to understand what they were part of," he said. "This is different. This is about what comes next. They should hear it from you." She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the phone and set it down again. A deliberate gesture, Not nervous, just the physical expression of a person making a decision and completing it. Tonight, she said, I'll talk to them tonight. That evening at 1900, Brooke stood in front of the full platoon in the briefing room. Not in a formal capacity, not with a podium or notes or the procedural framework of a military briefing. Just standing in front of them, most of them sitting, some of them leaning against the walls, all of them looking at her with the particular attention of people who have been through something together and are still close enough to it that the reverberations haven't fully settled. She told them about the program, about what Whitfield had said, about the 14 names and what they represented, and what she was being asked to do about them. She told them, clearly and without dramatizing it, about the commendation in the 4 years and the administrative failure. She didn't frame it as a grievance. She framed it as information, which was how she framed most true things. She told them about Torres. She hadn't planned to do that part. It came out the way some things come out when you're speaking directly to people you trust about things that matter. Not because you've decided to say them, but because the truth of them is present, and the space is right, and the people in the room have earned it. She told them that Torres had died on a hillside in Helmand Province during an operation that was not officially an operation, in a firefight that was not officially a firefight, in a role that was not officially combat. She told them that Torres had been the clearest person she'd ever known, clear about who she was, clear about what she was for, clear about what mattered and what didn't, and where the line was and how to stand on the right side of it, even when no one was watching. She told them that every decision she had made in the medical bay 5 days ago had been, in some essential way, made with Torres in mind. Not as a ghost, not as a memory that weighed on her, but as a standard. The standard of someone who didn't compromise on the things that were real. The room was very quiet when she finished. Garrett was, as Dylan had predicted and never mentioned again, not visibly crying. He was looking at the floor with the intensity of a man whose jaw was doing serious structural work. Harlan was looking at her with an expression that had no defenses in it. Just a man in his 30s sitting with the understanding of something he'd gotten wrong and the weight of the time it had taken him to get it right. Dylan was looking at her the way he'd looked at her from the first day she'd stitched him up, with the careful, quiet attention of someone who was storing everything, who was building something from what he was being given, and who would spend the rest of his career using it. Reyes, on his crutches in the back, was nodding slowly the way he'd nodded in the bay. The whole body nod of a person for whom the words have found a place to land. Voss said nothing. He was standing at the far side of the room, arms at his sides, and he was looking at her with the clean, uncomplicated look of a man who is proud of something and is not going to manage or diminish that feeling. He was just letting it be what it was. She looked at all of them, her people, the people she hadn't chosen and hadn't been chosen by, not officially, not on paper, and who were nonetheless hers in the way that people become yours when you've been through enough together. I'm going to Djibouti in 4 weeks, she said, and then I'm going wherever this program takes me. But I want you to know that this base, this room, this team, is where the thing I've been working toward my whole career finally came together. She paused. You gave me that by being willing to see past the badge and the paperwork and the category I'd been put in. You gave me that, and I don't take it lightly. Garrett made a sound. She looked at him. He was definitely not crying. Don't, he said, voice slightly rough. Don't make it sentimental. You're going to ruin the whole thing. She almost smiled. The real version, the full one that she so rarely let happen. Dismissed, she said. They filtered out slowly, the way people leave rooms when they don't entirely want to leave. There were hands briefly on her shoulder as they passed. Reyes, Harlan, 2 others whose names she'd known for 2 weeks and would carry for the rest of her life. Dylan was last. He stopped in front of her, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Then he reached into his jacket and held something out, small, flat, the kind of thing that has no obvious practical value and absolute, irreplaceable personal value. A photograph, worn at the edges. She looked at it. "That's my grandfather," he said. "On the ice. That's the lake I told you about, the one you brought up with Okafor." He paused. "I want you to have it, so when you're wherever you end up, working with those 14 people, and the work is hard, you have something cold to think about." She took it, looked at it for a long moment. An old man on a frozen lake with the particular satisfaction of someone completely at peace with exactly where they are. "Dylan," she said. "Yeah, you're going to be someone's Torres someday," she said. "You're already most of the way there." His jaw tightened. He nodded once, sharply, the way men nod when words have hit somewhere important, and they are managing the impact with everything they have. He left. She stood alone in the briefing room with the photograph in her hand. The 4 weeks that followed were the most complete 4 weeks Brooke Aldridge had spent in years. Not because they were easy. The work was the same work it always was. The days were long. The demands were real. But there was a quality to them that had not been present before. A quality of being fully known in the place where she was working, of moving through her days without any part of herself held back or managed or kept behind the careful neutrality she'd worn since leaving the service. She treated 12 more patients in those 4 weeks. Minor and moderate injuries, one case of suspected cardiac event in a logistics contractor that she managed until the evacuation team arrived. One recurrence of the young specialist's anxiety that she handled the same way she'd handled the first time. Sitting with him, asking him about something cold, staying until his hand stopped shaking. She worked with Dylan every day. She taught him things she hadn't planned to teach him, things that existed below the level of formal medical training and above the level of raw instinct. The middle space where experience lived, where the understanding of what a human body is doing under pressure becomes something you can read, like a language. He absorbed everything, perfectly, efficiently, and with the specific humility of someone who knows they are being given something valuable. She and Voss talked every evening, not debriefs, not professional consultations, just conversations. About the program, about the people in it, about the work that needed doing and the best way to do it. Sometimes about other things, about the career, about the nature of service, about what it meant to stay in something as long as they both had, and what it cost, and what it gave back. He was direct, and she was direct, and the conversations had the ease of two people who had decided to trust each other and were finding that the trust held. On the morning of her last day at the base, she did her final medical bay review the same way she'd done the first one, thoroughly, section by section, in the early light before anyone else was fully awake. She checked every shelf, confirmed every supply, made sure the trauma bags were staged correctly, that the secondary radio was charged, that the window covering she'd rigged was solid and would hold. She left a single page of handwritten notes on the counter. Not medical protocols, those were in the official files. These were the other things. The things that weren't in protocols. How to talk to Garrett when he was hurting and pretending not to be. How to recognize when someone was approaching a breaking point versus when they were just venting. Where she'd found the best sight lines in the bay and why she'd positioned things the way she had. Small, specific, real. The accumulated knowledge of 2 months of paying attention to people, which was all medicine was at the bottom of it. Paying attention to people. She signed it with her name. Brooke Aldridge. Not her rank, not her contractor designation. Just her name. Voss drove her to the transport himself. Dylan and Garrett and Reyes were there. Reyes still on one crutch, but insisting on standing without it, which she noted and didn't comment on. Harlan was there. Several others whose faces she had learned and would keep. She didn't make a speech. She shook hands. She held each one for a moment longer than a formal handshake. Not sentimental, just present, fully there for each one. Garrett made a joke that was better than his usual jokes, and she acknowledged it with an actual laugh, which made him look, briefly, stricken with pride. Dylan held her hand for a moment and said nothing. That was right. There was nothing left to say between them that hadn't already been said in better language than words. Voss walked her to the transport door. They stood for a moment. Anvil, he said. She looked at him. That's what the team has been calling you, he said, since the night of the breach. Not to your face, just between themselves. Anvil. He held her gaze. Because you're the thing everything gets tested against. Because you don't break. Because when the worst of it comes down on you, you hold your shape, and the thing hitting you is the thing that changes. She stood with that for a moment. The name, the weight of it, the specific meaning that these specific men had attached to it in the dark, in the aftermath, and the quiet of the days that followed. Anvil, she said. Anvil, he confirmed. She looked at him for a long, full, unguarded moment, and then she said what she'd been carrying since the debrief room, since Whitfield had told her about the 4 years, since the night of the breach when she'd stood in her bay with a rifle and 3 patients and one clear purpose, said it not as complaint, not as closure, but as the true and final word on all of it. I was always this, she said. I was always exactly this. It just took the right room and the right people for it to finally be visible. She picked up her bag, boarded the transport, sat down and looked forward. The transport lifted and the base fell away beneath her. And Brooke Aldridge, Marine Corps veteran, Lioness Program operative, Silver Star recipient, trauma nurse, and the woman they called Anvil, carried 14 names toward Djibouti and did not look back. Not because the past didn't matter, but because she had always known exactly who she was, and she had always known exactly where she was going. And for the first time in a very long time, the world knew it too.